Joining us now, Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, Democrat of Washington State. She's Korean on her mother's side. Congresswoman Strickland, appreciate you joining us. A number of Asian Americans testified today in front of the House Judiciary Committee on this uptick in violence. Have you noticed a change in behavior of attitudes towards Asian Americans since the pandemic began?
Oh, definitely. We know that hate crimes against Asian Americans have increased about 150% in most cities. And, I have friends who tell me stories of standing in line at the grocery store and having people say, you're responsible for this. I have friends who work in healthcare and they've told me stories of patients not wanting them to touch them because they're afraid to get COVID. And so, as I said on the House floor yesterday, Anderson, words matter. Leadership matters, and we have to stop using this rhetoric that tragically, I believe, ended in death in Atlanta.
The fact that your House colleague, Congressman Roy, thought today was a good day to bring up lynching in terms that seemed kind of glowing about the days when, mobs would lynch people, and he said in the state of Texas from trees, is at the very least bizarre, if not wildly offensive. I mean, famously 17 Chinese men and boys were lynched by an angry mob in 1871 in this country. I mean, is there any reason to believe that Chip Roy understands or is really concerned about the fear that many in the Asian American community are feeling right now? Because he seemed to want to talk about a lot of other groups.
Yeah, I think with someone like Chip Roy is that he probably knows better, but he likes to use language that's inflammatory and dramatic. And here we are in the news talking about him. And so, if he chooses to be ignorant, that's his thing. But what we need to do is speak out against that ignorance and that hate.
Law enforcement has not ruled out calling the shooting a hate crime. Do you see it as a hate crime?
I do see it as a hate crime, and there are many elements into this. This was, 8 people were murdered. This was a result of gun violence, but I also believe it was an issue around racism and bigotry. And these were women who worked in a spa, and the shooter went there looking for them. And so we can talk about economic anxiety. We can talk about sexual addiction, but I want to make sure that people understand that when women are murdered, when women of color are murdered, there is often a nexus between racism and misogyny, and we cannot ignore that.
We've learned even more attacks today learned of more attacks on Asian Americans. When you read these stories, you watch videos of elderly Asian Americans being pushed to the ground completely randomly by people just passing by, families in restaurants being verbally harassed, spit on the street. I spoke with basketball player Jeremy Lin last night. He talked about how important it is for Asian Americans to stand up and speak out about it. And he does feel that there's kind of this change, particularly in the younger generation in this country, and their willingness to, and their sense of urgency about speaking out. Is it enough to speak out, or are you afraid that these attacks against Asian Americans are just going to continue to rise?
So, with any type of attacks on any group or any hate crimes, we need people to be punished and held accountable. And I think that's what has to change. And, you're right. When Jeremy Lim talked about the fact that people have maybe historically remained quiet about it or not wanted to confront it or to speak out, that has to change. And I do believe that for some people, there's a narrative that if you're Asian American and something happens to you, that you're just going to be quiet and go away. And that things have changed. We saw protests happening around the country yesterday. We're talking about allyship between, African Americans, Latino Americans, and people who want to join with us. And so this is just another example of the tragic history of racism that this country has. And it started with slavery. We know that it included the expulsion of Chinese Americans, the internment of Japanese, the way Mexican Americans are often demonized during economic crises. And here we are during COVID, now having hate against Asian Americans. And so people are exhausted. People want folks to be held accountable. And we need allies who are going to speak out with us.
Were you surprised when you heard I don't know if you saw the press conference, but you may have read about the remarks made by representative from the sheriff's office in Gwinnett County, where the shooter was apprehended and where the first shooting took place, essentially said that the shooter was having a bad day and was at the end of his rope. That's not kind of language if the shooter was not I'm wondering how you interpreted those statements.
Well, it's absurd that someone would even make that remark. But you know who had a bad day, Anderson? The 8 people who were murdered. You know who had a bad day? The family members and loved ones who had to get phone calls from officials telling them that their loved ones died. And so to say that someone had a bad day is another example of excusing something and making excuses for people.
Yeah. By the way, it was Cherokee County. I think I misspoke. Congresswoman Strickland, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
All right.
Coming
Thanks
up-
for having me, Anderson.